For 54 years, the federal government of the United States has told you, in writing, that marijuana is as dangerous as heroin. Same category, same restrictions, same legal status. And yesterday, for the first time since Richard Nixon signed a piece of paper in 1970, that officially changed. Welcome to the biggest shift in American drug law in more than half a century. And whether you have ever touched marijuana in your life or never plan to, what happened yesterday in Washington affects you directly, through your taxes, through medical research, through the economy, and through a fundamental question that has been sitting unanswered for over 5 decades. Why was marijuana ever in the same category as heroin in the first place? I am going to answer that question today. I am going to walk you through exactly what happened, exactly what it means, exactly what it does not mean, because there is a lot of confusion flying around right now, and exactly what comes next. Because this story is bigger than the headlines, and by the end of this video, you are going to understand it better than 90% of people talking about it online right now. Let's start at the very beginning. Because to understand why yesterday was such a big deal, you have to understand how we got here, and how deeply, profoundly political the original decision was. The year is 1970. Richard Nixon is president. The country is in turmoil. Vietnam protests, the civil rights movement, counterculture spreading through every college campus in America. Nixon needed political tools, and according to his own domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman, who admitted this in a 1994 interview that was published in 2016, the administration found one in drugs. Ehrlichman said directly that the Nixon White House had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black Americans. And he said that by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, they could disrupt those communities. That quote came from a man who served as Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor. It is documented. It is verified. It is part of the historical record. Here is something even more telling. In 1970, before Congress officially placed marijuana in Schedule I, the government's own Assistant Secretary of Health wrote a letter to Congress saying the classification was intended to be provisional, meaning temporary, pending further review and research. In 1972, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, which Nixon himself had created, released a full report recommending the decriminalization of cannabis. Nixon ignored it completely. He did not want the science. He wanted the policy tool. That is the context in which the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was signed into law. That is the environment in which marijuana was placed in Schedule I, the most restrictive federal drug category, reserved for substances defined as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The same list as heroin, the same list as LSD, the same list as ecstasy. Congress placed marijuana there based on, by its own admission at the time, limited scientific evidence. The placement was described by a government health official as provisional. That was in 1970. 54 years passed, and the provisional placement never moved. Even in 1988, a DEA administrative law judge named Francis Young concluded, after extensive formal hearings that lasted years, that marijuana was, in his words, one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man, and formally recommended it be moved out of Schedule I. The DEA administrator at the time, John Lawn, rejected that recommendation and kept marijuana in Schedule I anyway. That is how entrenched this classification was. A judge inside the DEA's own system said move it, and the head of the DEA said no. Meanwhile, the real world kept moving in a completely different direction from federal law. States started legalizing medical marijuana in 1996 when California passed Proposition 215. Then more states followed, and more, and more. Today, 40 states in America have approved medical marijuana programs. 24 states plus Washington, D.C. have legalized recreational marijuana for adults. The cannabis industry in the United States generated an estimated $30 billion in legal sales in 2024 alone. Tens of millions of Americans use it legally under state law every single year. People with cancer, with PTSD, with chronic pain, with neurological disorders, veterans, elderly patients, people who tried every pharmaceutical option and found relief in something that the federal government was simultaneously telling them had no medical use. That contradiction has now cracked wide open. Here is exactly what happened on April 23, 2026. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, under the direction of President Donald Trump, signed an official order immediately placing two specific categories of marijuana into Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. Those two categories are FDA-approved products containing marijuana and marijuana products regulated by a qualifying state-issued medical license. 40 states operate medical cannabis programs. Those programs are now effectively legitimized at the federal level for the first time in American history. The order also initiated a brand new expedited administrative hearing process to consider the broader rescheduling of all marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. That hearing is scheduled to begin on June 29, 2026. So what happened Thursday is a two-track move: immediate reclassification for medical marijuana right now, and a formal process beginning in June to potentially reclassify all marijuana. Acting Attorney General Blanche said clearly in a statement, "The Department of Justice is delivering on President Trump's promise to expand Americans' access to medical treatment options. This rescheduling action allows for research on the safety and efficacy of this substance, ultimately providing patients with better care and doctors with more reliable information." And Trump himself? Days earlier, at a Saturday signing ceremony in the Oval Office for a separate executive order on psychedelics research, which we covered on this channel, Trump apparently turned to a DOJ or White House official mid-event and said, "You're going to get the rescheduling done, right, please?" The man who issued the executive order in December 2025, directing his Attorney General to move as fast as legally possible, was clearly impatient. And now it is done. Now here is the part that most headlines are glossing over, and this is the part that will actually affect millions of people's lives immediately. Under Schedule 3, marijuana is now in the same federal category as ketamine, as anabolic steroids, as Tylenol with codeine. These are recognized as substances with accepted medical use and moderate to low potential for physical or psychological dependence. That is a fundamentally different legal and scientific characterization than Schedule 1. And the practical consequences are enormous. The single biggest immediate impact is taxes. For decades, cannabis businesses in the United States have been operating under a federal tax rule called IRS Section 280E. Here is what 280E does. Under federal law, any business that sells a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 substance cannot deduct ordinary business expenses on its federal taxes. Normal businesses can deduct rent, payroll, utilities, insurance, inventory costs. Cannabis businesses could not. Zero deductions. At all. For any of those things. The result was that some cannabis operators were paying effective federal tax rates estimated by industry researchers at over 70% of their revenue. Not their profit. Their revenue. A cannabis dispensary making $2 million in sales could be paying over $1 million in federal taxes, even if its actual profit was a fraction of that. That is not a business model. That is a government-imposed financial punishment for operating legally under state law. That punishment ends now, at least for state-licensed medical marijuana businesses. Schedule 3 is not covered by 280E. The Justice Department's order also explicitly encourages the Treasury Secretary to consider providing retroactive 280E relief for past tax years. Read that again. Retroactive. Relief. For taxes already paid under a classification that has now been changed. That is potentially a multi-billion-dollar financial shift back toward the cannabis industry. The research implications are equally massive. Under Schedule 1, scientists who wanted to study marijuana's potential medical uses faced a bureaucratic obstacle course that had no parallel for any other substance. You needed a Schedule 1 researcher license. You faced strict laboratory regulations. You had extremely limited access to supply for study. For years, the only federally legal marijuana available for research came from a single facility at the University of Mississippi. The product from that facility was reportedly so low quality and different from what patients were actually using in states with medical programs that researchers said the studies were barely relevant to real-world use. The result was that even as millions of patients were using medical marijuana under state law, the formal clinical research base was thin and inadequate. Pharmaceutical companies that might fund large clinical trials stayed away because you cannot patent a naturally occurring plant, meaning there was no financial incentive to run expensive trials worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And without clinical data, regulators could not formally approve medical applications. Doctors who wanted to recommend it to patients had no large-scale peer-reviewed studies to rely on. Patients who wanted it had to navigate a patchwork of state laws, dispensary regulations, and wildly varying product quality. It was a loop deliberately designed to never close. Harvard law professor Carmel Shocker put it plainly. She noted that requiring clinical trial data for Schedule I substances created a strange set of incentives because clinical trials are expensive, and the players who have the money to run them are for-profit pharmaceutical companies. But those companies are not going to invest in something they cannot patent. So naturally occurring marijuana sat in a regulatory black hole for decades, too restricted to study properly, too studied informally to pretend it had no value, and too normalized in state law to maintain the pretense that it belonged alongside heroin. That loop is now broken for medical cannabis. Researchers can access Schedule III substances with dramatically less bureaucratic burden. That means better studies, better clinical data, better information for doctors prescribing it for chronic pain, PTSD, neurological disorders, cancer treatment side effects, epilepsy, and dozens of other conditions where patients have been using it under state law without solid federal research to guide dosing, interactions, or long-term safety. Now, and this is critical, here is what yesterday's order does not do. It does not legalize marijuana at the federal level, not for medical use, not for recreational use. It is still a federal crime to sell, distribute, or possess marijuana outside of the specific categories covered by this order. Recreational cannabis in adult use states remains Schedule I under federal law pending the June 29th hearing. The order does not solve the banking problem. Cannabis businesses in states that also sell recreationally still face major obstacles accessing traditional financial services, because those recreational sales remain federally illegal. And there is a genuinely complicated situation that one industry expert described perfectly. He noted that federal law now effectively recognizes three separate categories for the same plant: hemp, medical marijuana, and all other marijuana. The first two are now Schedule III. The third is still Schedule I, still in the same legal category as heroin. The same plant, three different federal classifications. That is the level of complexity the cannabis industry is now navigating. There is also political pushback. The anti-legalization group Smart Approaches to Marijuana, known as SAM, immediately condemned the move. Their president, Kevin Sabet, said today's marijuana is more dangerous than previously thought, not less dangerous, and that until data shows otherwise, it meets current criteria for Schedule I. Sabet argued that modern cannabis products are far more potent than cannabis decades ago, and that the science does not support reclassification. Other legal experts raised concerns that the process used, the Attorney General invoking a streamlined international treaty compliance pathway rather than the traditional notice and comment rulemaking, could face court challenges from anti-legalization groups. Those challenges are expected, and the June 29th hearing process for broader reclassification is where that legal battle will play out. Cannabis stocks reacted in a volatile but ultimately skeptical way. Shares in major cannabis companies spiked initially on the news and then pulled back and turned negative by the close of trading Thursday. Investors apparently decided that the partial, targeted nature of the reclassification, covering medical but not recreational, was narrower than many had hoped. Industry analysts noted that while medical marijuana operators will see immediate financial relief from 280E, the bigger prize, full Schedule III status for all cannabis, including recreational, still depends on what happens after June 29th. The CEO of cannabis company Green Thumb Industries, Ben Kovler, put it in historical perspective. He said since Nixon's Controlled Substances Act more than 50 years ago, this is the first major step towards opening up the product in a way that will make it much more investable. He called it a step in the right direction, while acknowledging major obstacles remain. And here is the political dimension that makes this story genuinely fascinating, and which almost no mainstream outlet is giving enough space to. This is a Republican president, with a Republican acting Attorney General, taking an action that the cannabis industry has been pushing for under Democratic and Republican administrations alike for decades. The Biden administration started this process in 2022, when Biden directed the Department of Health and Human Services and the DEA to review marijuana scheduling. The HHS completed that review in 2023 and recommended rescheduling. The DEA began a formal rulemaking process. They put it out for public comment. 43,000 people responded. And then the process stalled in the handoff between administrations, with hearings that got delayed and a timeline that dragged on with no clear end in sight. Trump did not just inherit that process, he accelerated it. His December 2025 executive order explicitly directed the Attorney General to move in the most expeditious manner possible consistent with federal law. And when the process seemed to be going slowly, Trump said so publicly and directly. Just days before the rescheduling order was signed, he reportedly turned to officials at the Oval Office and said, "You're going to get the rescheduling done, right, please?" That is not the behavior of a president slow-walking drug reform. That is a conservative president actively pushing it through. And that matters for the historical record. The war on drugs was a Republican project. It was Nixon in 1970. It was Reagan in the 1980s who ramped up enforcement dramatically, with mandatory minimum sentencing and the famous Just Say No campaign. The political party that built and defended that system for 50 years now has a president who just made the single biggest crack in it. Whatever your political views, that is a genuinely remarkable historical development that deserves to be acknowledged. There is one more piece of this story that I want you to sit with, because it speaks to something bigger than the policy itself. The cannabis industry in America, legal, state-licensed, tax-paying businesses that have operated in full compliance with state law for years, has been operating under effective federal tax rates of over 70% in some cases. 70%. These are businesses that pay rent, hire employees, buy inventory, pay for security, invest in their communities. And the federal government has been taking more than 2/3 of their revenue in taxes, while simultaneously telling them they could not access the banking system, could not get loans, could not list on major stock exchanges, could not operate like any other legal business in America. All because a president in 1970 needed a political tool and classified their product alongside heroin. That ends yesterday for medical marijuana operators. And for the millions of Americans who use medical cannabis legally, for the researchers who have been trying to study it properly for decades, for the veterans with PTSD who found relief in it when pharmaceutical options failed, for the cancer patients who used it to manage the side effects of chemotherapy, yesterday was the day the federal government finally admitted something the rest of the country figured out a long time ago. 54 years is a long time to wait for a provisional classification to be reviewed, but it happened. And now the next chapter, June 29th, the broader hearing, the legal challenges, the question of recreational marijuana's federal status, begins. This is a story we will keep following on this channel every step of the way. What comes next is the June 29th hearing. The DEA will take up the question of whether all marijuana, not just medical, should move from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Anti-legalization groups have already vowed to fight it. Legal challenges are coming, and Congress has its own role to play in the long game. The banking access question, the tax code question, the question of whether recreational cannabis ever gets federal protection, all of that still requires legislative action that the executive order alone cannot provide. But what happened on April 23, 2026 is history. 54 years of federal policy rooted in political calculation, racial tension, and scientific neglect took its first real crack. 40 states' medical marijuana programs were legitimized at the federal level for the first time. Thousands of cannabis businesses got relief from a tax burden that was systematically strangling them. And millions of patients who have been using legal medical marijuana under state law are now doing so with the federal government finally acknowledging, for the first time ever, that this substance has accepted medical value. That is a story worth understanding completely, and now you do. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what actually changed, and more importantly what it means for real people, hit that like button right now and drop a comment below. Where do you stand on this? Do you think the reclassification went far enough? Should recreational marijuana follow? Is this long overdue or does it go too far? This comment section is a conversation and every perspective is welcome. Subscribe to John Cooper and hit the notification bell so you never miss a breakdown on the stories shaping America. We go deeper, we stay longer, and we make sure you actually understand what is going on, not just what happened. See you in the next one.